should you go into private practice cardiology or should you not? So I debated for a very long time of whether or not I should make this video or this podcast if you're listening to the audio version. There are a lot of pros and cons of going into private practice versus just being an employed physician. I'll give you a little bit of the history and the background, and then I'll tell you what I think most physicians should do. Now, the reason I decided to finally make this video was because I was at a cardiology conference last week, and one of the roundtable discussions was cardiology fellows get to ask practicing cardiologists random questions like, what advice would you give a cardiologist that's not graduated yet? There's cardiology fellows or cardiologists that have not graduated yet. So the older cardiologists who are already established and have been working for 5, 10, 20 years, whatever it might be, were sitting on like a panel, and the audience of cardiology fellows or medical residents or students or what have you was asking them, what advice would you give a medical student, or what advice would you give a cardiology fellow? One of the most interesting questions, and there were several, and then I realized you opened up a can of worms here. One of the most interesting questions was, what advice would you give a new cardiologist? I'm about to graduate in a year and a half. I'm like halfway done, and I'm considering private practice versus going and being an employed physician. Now, just so you guys know, being employed means you go work for this giant healthcare company like Kaiser Permanente, Advocate out of Chicago, whatever it might be, just a giant, huge group. You get a salary and you go home. You put in your 9 to 5, whatever, and you go home. Being in private practice means you own the practice, you own the group, you do the hiring, you do the firing. It's a lot more work. Historically, just so you guys know, in the past, it was all private practice. In the 70s and 80s and 90s, most cardiology practices, most physicians' practices were all private practice. My father was one of them. And the reason this kind of touches home is because I have a lot of experience with this. My father was a private physician. He's a surgeon, and he owned his own practice, him and his partner. As time went on, multiple groups started asking them to buy. There's these large groups in town, and they're like, hey, can we buy your practice? Can we buy your practice? Over time, some of his partners left. One of his partners retired. He hired 2 more new ones. They didn't work really hard. They'd never generated enough to even pay their own salaries. He was subsidizing them. They wanted to sell the group to this big corporation, and he did not. So the other 2 younger ones left and joined the corporation for a quote bigger guaranteed salary, while my father stayed independent and obviously made all of his money. And so this goes back into the late 90s, early 2000s. These large corporations are trying to purchase physicians' practices because they feel that if they bring everything in-house, where they have the family doctors, they bought up the family doctors first. They went out and bought up every family practice, every internal medicine, every pediatrician. They buy up all the primary groups, and then they have the primary groups refer to their specialists. They think they can maximize total revenue with this. That's a whole other story. We can get into the economics of it later. I have an economics degree. I actually have a business degree. I did not get a biology degree or chemistry degree. My undergraduate degree was actually in business. It was in economics. And I did business for quite some time before I went to medical school. And I've always been entrepreneurial. Ever since I was a kid, I would run these newsletters. I made these small little companies. Even when I was like 16, 17 years old, I was investing in the stock market. I made newsletters too. My most famous newspapers or newsletters were Paintball Times and Football Times, both of which still exist today. Eventually, there was Hunting Times and Bass Fishing Times and Ohio something Times, Ohio Golf Times or something. There's a whole bunch of them. The only 2 that I still have are Football Times and Paintball Times, but that's neither here nor there. The internet finally started to take off in the late 90s, and you can make a lot of money on websites with affiliate marketing and all kinds of stuff. That's neither here nor there. Let's get back to the practice of medicine. So back to this conference. The younger cardiologists have not graduated yet. Asked the older cardiologists, what do you guys advise regarding private practice versus employment? And there was a panel of 6 or 7 people up there. None of them were in private practice. So they all said something to the effect of, well, I'm not in private practice and I used to be, and here's what my advice would be. They asked the crowd, hey, is anyone still in private practice? Because maybe that person can answer your questions better than we can. So I raised my hand. I was like, hey, I'm in private practice. How can I help you? I do this all the time. I love being in private practice. I think it's the most amazing thing in the world. And if you have questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. So they're like, hey, why don't you come up here? Come up here. So I walked up to the stage and took a seat and started answering questions. So most of the cardiologists that answered before me that were no longer in private practice, and right now there's almost no private practice. Back when I was in Chicago doing my training, there was a group, there was a private multi-specialty group. It was called Midwest Physicians Group or something. It started with an M, Physicians Group, something like that. It was a huge, group of family doctors, optometrists, or ophthalmologists, and pretty much every specialty you can imagine, surgeons, whatever, even cardiology groups and pulmonary groups and hospital groups, whatever. They eventually got bought up by Advocate, one of these large groups. They did not buy the cardiology practice, though, or some of them did not want to go along. So the cardiology practice renamed themselves cardio specialists, and then some of them got bought up later, and then another group opened up and made their own practice, and then the Franciscan Alliance bought their practice. So I have a lot of experience with this, especially when it comes to cardiology. Obviously, a lot of this when it comes to primary care is a lot different. But at least in the cardiology realm, I have a lot of experience with this because also now I am a private practice cardiologist and we own our own practice. We have a group of partners and we own the practice. And I can tell you on a very intimate and deep level, a lot of the details about some of these questions that you may have. So with that all said, and including my father's background, my father was part of a surgery group, and ultimately all these large entities were vying to purchase them. I also have friends in Chicago whose private practices were bought up by private equity. And we've met with lots of private equity. Every day in my inbox, there's these giant private equity and venture capitalist firms that want to buy up practices, soup them up, turn them around, make some profit, and then sell them off again for hundreds of millions, if not $500 million. That's just how it is in this world. These people have billions and billions of dollars to spend, and they don't know where to spend it. And they're reaching out to dentist office, chiropractors' offices, medical practices. We're like the only private practice group still left in almost all of the United States. Probably there's probably a few, but at this gigantic medical conference, there was easily 3,000 people there, and not a single person raised their hand saying they were in private practice. The stories that were being told by the other cardiologists, some of them were very sad, and some of them they sounded miserable. They sounded like they hated their lives. And I'll tell you the two kind of models, and then we'll go into detail of maybe how each one works. So being in private practice, you, the cardiologist, you and your partners, you own the practice, which means you have to do everything. You have to be in charge of billing. You have to have somebody in charge of human resources, or you do it. You got to be in charge of the website, the marketing, the chief executive officer, the president, the CEO, the treasurer. You have to be the hiring and firing person. You have to be the one who interviews new cardiologists. You have to put out ads to find new cardiologists. And we've done that. And I'll do a whole other video on stupid things you shouldn't say or do at an interview when you're a doctor trying to be hired. That's a whole other video segment. If you guys think that's a good video, put some comments below. But there's a lot of things that you should not do or say when you are looking for a new job as a doctor. So I think that one would be a super interesting video as well. But that's neither here nor there right now. So you are everything when you are in private practice. The alternative is being hired by a large group. And when you're hired by a large group, you're basically just a W-2 employee. You get you show up to work, you do your 7 to 7 or 9 to 5 or 8 to 3, whatever it might be. You do your job and then you go home with no responsibilities. You might be on call, sure, but there's no responsibilities as to we need a new front desk person, we need to hire a new cardiologist, we need to find a new IT guy. The website looks, there's some dated information on the website, who's in charge of the Instagram account, there's none of that. And you just go home and these big corporations pay you. And as you can probably imagine, it's easier on the physician. What happened is back in the 90s, and I can tell you this because my father went through this, a lot of private practice doctors we're told, and even my dad, even surgeons, he's a specialist, they were told, listen, just come work for us. We guarantee your salary. What's your salary right now? 400,000? Boom. And I realize the numbers I'm going to be throwing out there are very, very high compared to what the average person in the United States makes. So I know this comes from a place of privilege. Please don't take it as that. Imagine you're talking about basketball players or football players. These guys make millions and millions of dollars. They've made it to a level of play or skill level or whatever where they're highly sought after athletes. So physicians are very similar. And I realize, some of these numbers I might be throwing out there saying, oh my God, they're only paying this guy 200,000 when most people in the world would dream of making 200,000. I totally get that. So I'm not trying to diminish that at all. And I know obviously this comes from a place of privilege, but I'm just being real with you. I'm throwing real numbers out there, not real, but semi-real numbers out there, some examples of what you might hear or what you might see. So they come up to these doctors, let's say like a surgeon, like, hey, you make 400,000, you got to pay the rent, you got to pay your malpractice, you got to pay John at the front desk, you got to pay the IT guy, you don't even have a marketing team, you don't have anything, come join us, we'll pay you the 400,000, you just got to show up from 8 to 5 and then go home. What do you think? Do you want to do that? We'll take care of the secretary, the malpractice, we'll cover everything. You just show up and do your job and let us take care of the rest. So this sounds like a dream. Like if you're a doctor and you're like, man, I don't have to do the paperwork anymore. I don't have to do the billing. I don't have to hire anybody or fire anybody. I don't have to worry about marketing. I don't have to go out and reach out to people. This big company will do all this stuff for me. As a physician, that is a dream. Like I went to med school because I want to take care of patients. And this is like a dream scenario. You just get to do the patients, do the surgeries, and go home. Somebody else takes care of all the nonsense, right? It sounds like a dream come true scenario. Somebody takes care of all the stuff that doctors don't ever want to do. We always talk about, I just want to see patients. I just want to take care of patients. I didn't sign up for this. I don't want to sit here and write notes and dissertations and do the billing and all this paperwork. Doctors are always complaining there's so much paperwork involved. I get that. But these people came along and they said, listen, you do the doctor stuff. We'll do all the nonsense that you don't want to do. We'll pay you the 400,000. Everything will go great. Everyone will be happy. And this is how it started out, especially at the primary care level with like family doctors and whatnot. Eventually, it went up the ranks to other specialties. So they hire you. You're a family doctor. You're making your, let's say, $250 a year, and everything's going well. Mary up front, who's the secretary, receptionist, what have you, she's not as friendly anymore to you and kind of realizes that you're no longer her boss. Z Corporation bought you and she answers to Z now. No matter what you tell her, she kind of ignores you, doesn't really care. And you're like, Mary or whoever, whatever name I used, I forget, John, you got to be nicer to the patients. What are you doing? You're scaring patients away. And you can't really fire John because now you got to talk to corporate, who has to talk to DC, and their headquarters might be in New York. And then he has to talk to so-and-so, and it's like a nightmare. I'm exaggerating it slightly, but these are the kind of scenarios that you will face. And I've heard of nightmare scenarios where people have faced this. Or the monitor stops working. You can't just go to Best Buy and buy a $50 monitor to replace your monitor. Now you have to talk to corporate. Corporate has to get it approved. We might put it in next year's budget. The nightmare continues. It becomes a scenario that is very, very difficult to deal with. And I get it. Some corporations and entities probably do this better than others. These are just the worst case scenarios, but they're far too common and happen way too often that you just can't ignore these and sweep them under the rug. Like these are extreme scenarios and extreme cases and Dr. Allo is exaggerating. I'm not. This literally actually happens at many of these places. The other thing that starts to happen is Dr. So-and-so starts to get disenfranchised. Like, you know what? Why am I working my butt off? They realize that, I'm getting paid that 400,000. And these guys found a way to optimize the billing and the malpractice, and they're saving money on this, and they're cutting deals with this and cutting deals with that. They're making, let's say, $2 million off of me, and I'm getting 400,000. Why do I want to keep doing this? They start to realize, I'm like their workhorse. I'm putting in all this time and money, and I'm making only 400, and they're making 2 million off of me. I'm exaggerating a little bit because I don't, the numbers don't always exactly add up to that. But you start to realize that you're kind of making a lot of money for your new boss, your new owners. And so the first batch of people that were purchased were kind of on these contracts. You make $400,000 a year as long as you do your job. Doctors also realized when they were on these first contracts that, you know what, instead of seeing 20 patients a day, I could probably see 18, still making that guaranteed $400,000. Another year goes by. Tell Jenny, don't schedule more than 12 patients. Just leave it at 12. 12 is good. And then these corporations start, they used to make $1.5 million off of you. Now it's like 1.1. Next year it's like 700. What's going on here? We're paying this guy 400. 52% is usually overhead. If you're paying the guy 400, you need about 500, let's say, to keep the lights on and keep the malpractice going and the staff and the equipment and the copy machine and the laser printer, whatever. I'm starting to break even here. What's going on here? Another year goes by. I can only see 6 patients a day. I can only do half a day clinic on Fridays. Because there's no incentive to work. And I'm not saying it's bad or the doctors are evil people or anything. It's just human nature. When the incentives don't align, and we'll get into incentives and financial incentives, especially later, but when the incentives don't align, there's not a lot of reason to go out of your way. Now, if you were private practice and you're like, oh man, put 30 people on the list, whatever, I put in 30 patients. So there is definitely a little bit of that probably goes on where the doctor's productivity started to go down. The people in charge were not making as much. And they're like, you know what? Let's do this. Let's put a baseline salary. Dr. Jones will make $200,000. And if he reaches this much amount of work level, and in the medical world, these are called RVUs, worked RVUs, revenue value unit or something like that. But let's say an amount of production. You do 10,000 hours a year. And whatever those hours might be. They're not exactly in hours, but they're in hours. So let's say if Dr. Jones, the average family doctor, does 5,000 RVUs a year. And if he gets the 6,000 every year, we'll give him the other 150. So now he's making a 200 base salary plus 150 if he hits 6,000 RVUs, worked units or whatever. If he does that, we'll give him the money. If not, there's no reason to give him that extra 150. Maybe it'll just be 100 if he hits 5,000. There's these incentives built in now because humans are like that. It's human nature and it makes sense. If you have no incentive to work and you're still going to be getting paid $1 million a year, you wouldn't work and you'd be getting paid $1 million a year. So they realize that you can't just offer people salaries without incentive to keep them working at the same level that they were working. So now the new models for employed physicians are usually, if you generate at least 8,000 RVUs a year, you'll get your 450, right? And that sounds reasonable. Dr. So-and-so does 4,000 hours or whatever, units, RVUs. He's not going to make it to 8,000 every year. Why should we pay the guy 450? We can pay him probably 200 or 250 since he's working about half as much. Now, this creates a lot of issues because the incentive structure also doesn't align. Now, let's say you work for a hospital system where you're 4 cardiologists, right? Me and 3 other guys. I have to make 8,000. I have to generate 8,000 units a year, and they all have to generate 8,000 units a year. In my mind, I start to realize, you know what? If I see 3 more patients in clinic, and if I read 2 more echoes, and if I read all the nuclears, I can actually generate more RVUs than the next guy. The next guy next to me is stuck in the cath lab all day. There's different specialties in cardiology. There are some where you do procedures all day. The guy who's doing procedures all day, if he's stuck in the cath lab only generating a couple RVUs a day, and I'm reading nuclears, which are a type of stress test, obviously. If I'm reading nuclear stress tests all day and I can generate 50 RVUs a day, why wouldn't I just do more of that? Right? So you start to realize the incentives and where the RVUs lie and how much more you can make by not doing certain things. And that's what happens. We had a group in Chicago when I was there, when they were first purchased by one of these big companies. One of the doctors would run down to the vascular lab and collect all the vascular orders so he could read them at the end of the day when they were finally done. Because if you don't collect those papers, this was back when everything was paper. You collect all the paper orders. Now you know the names and the medical record numbers of all the patients that are getting vascular tests on that day, and you can read them. Those tests generate the most amount of money, for that guy. Another guy would go and steal all the echo papers. Another guy would go and want to read all the nuclears before they were done. Everyone was avoiding seeing patients in the hospital or in clinic or, doing procedures because the incentives did not align. And that's problematic. The best way to structure it if you were in private practice or even at a hospital group is that everything dumps into one big bucket. All the work has to be done. There's a guy who's good at reading echoes, nuclears, vasculars, a guy's good at caths, a guy's good at clinic, whatever. If it all dumps into one big bucket and everybody splits it up in the end, then the incentives align and you're no longer like in competition with your own coworkers. So the problem with that structure that happened in Chicago is now you became your own partner's competition. At first, they were a private group. They all worked together. No big deal. Once the hospital purchased them and became their owners, now they were in competition with themselves. Like, my partner's my competitor now. I don't want to get fired if I'm only doing 2,000 RVUs by the end of next year when they reevaluate everything. Why would they keep me? The guy over here is generating 10,000 RVUs, right? So huge problem there. Another huge problem, and hospital administrators, God bless them, they're amazing people and I work with them every day. We have lots and lots of meetings. So this is not, I'm not saying these things to kind of talk negatively about hospital administrators and admins and COOs and the C-suite professionals, because I know they didn't create this system. They're doing their best with the system that they have. This all happened, late 90s, early 2000s, and some of it, slowly over time has developed. I think they are coming up with better models. We have some groups that I've talked to and some people that I've interviewed. I plan on bringing you guys a series about this exact topic, like why should you go into private practice versus not private practice. I'm going to interview a bunch of people, hopefully to discuss this a little bit more. Another issue that happens is the hospital group, hires a vascular surgeon, let's say. They hire a vascular surgeon. Hey, man, we'll hire you. Here's $400,000 a year. As long as you generate 8,000 RVUs, we're good, right? The guy is working along. The next year, they're looking at it, man, the guy's generating 12,000 RVUs. This is fantastic. Well, if this guy's, we're only paying him 400, he's generating about $3 million worth of, revenue. Why don't we add another one? We can make 6 million, right? So they're like, let's expand the service line. And they sell it to you in these meetings. Oh, we're going to expand the service line. You don't have to be on call as often. You'll be on call just half as much. You could take every other weekend off, every other week off if you want to. We're going to expand the service line. That's literally like the kind of language that they use. And it sounds good. And I'm not saying overall it's bad. Sometimes just the implementation turns out terrible. They hire another vascular surgeon, right? They're like, hey, same thing, we'll pay you $400,000. Come here, you'll love it here. You'll be on call, 50% of the time. You don't have to work by yourself anymore. Just come on over. They hire this guy. He comes over. The 12,000 RVUs. Maybe it goes up to 14,000, and now they're splitting it between the two guys. And instead of, actually doubling to 6 million, they're actually only making like 3.5, maybe 4 million. So they're like, that kind of didn't work. RVUs barely went up. We still need to expand the service line. They hired 2 more. Now that 14,000 RVUs literally is being split amongst 4 people. I don't know what the math is, but let's say everybody now is generating 4,000 to 5,000 RVUs amongst 4 people. So let's say it's like 16,000 now. Each one's generating 4,000 RVUs. The service line expanded. You got 4 guys or girls, and they're on call every 4th weekend, only 25% of the time. It's a great lifestyle. They're getting paid $400,000. But the service line didn't really expand. There's not that much more RVUs. There's not that many more cases. There's not that many more patients that need vascular surgery. Now you're stuck with 4 people that are generating just 16,000 RVUs, which you thought they would be generating you instead of 3 million, 12 million, multiply it by 4, and they're not. It's barely 4, maybe 5 million. So you're kind of spending all this money on overhead and all this, and they're not really making you that much more. And not only that, but what happened is now the guys, they're all generating 4,000 RVUs. We hired you guys to generate 8,000, and you're not, and it's half. Why should we keep paying you 400,000? We'll just drop your salaries. Since you didn't hit your targets, we'll drop your salaries. And of course, this is all in your contract. And they always throw crazy stuff in your contract. So make sure you have a really good contract attorney looking at this. Instead of since you're not making that, you're only making 4,000 RVUs instead of 8,000, we're going to drop your salary to 200,000 a piece. Now, all you and all these people that are quote unquote your partners are making only 200,000 a piece, and they're still making that, 4 or 5 million, whatever it is now. and the RVUs didn't go up. There's not that much more work. Now you're in competition with one another again. They expanded the service line to make it bigger and better. And now you have to scramble to try to find more work. You got to go to like cities that are further away. And this happens all the time. Like, oh, where are you today? Oh, I'm in blah, blah, little town. Where's that? It's like an hour and a half away. Why? I spend a week there and I come back for the other 3 weeks here. Why is that? So I can get all my RVUs so they can pay me. And just to make your salary and make those RVUs, you need to start going, to further and further things, or you eventually just leave and they hire the next person that graduates. So this is a problem. The other issue with these large corporations is they have to have these predatory, very high salaries. We hire cardiologists, almost every year, and we interview them, and we see their contracts that they're getting from some of these other places. And I talk to them, and I interview them, and I go to conferences. People send me stuff all the time because they know I'm a cardiologist, and I'm America's cardiologist, whatever. So people ask me questions all the time, especially about this kind of stuff. Like, what do you think of this contract? Here's kind of the bullet points of it. And especially on LinkedIn. LinkedIn, people send you contracts all the time. And the other thing that's like super nice is because I'm so well known, if I say I'm looking for a cardiologist or a vascular tech, I get like hundreds of applications, like literally within seconds. I just make a quick post. Hey, any cardiologists want to move to where I am? We're hiring. Boom. You immediately within seconds, you have 15 CVs and applications. Everybody, first of all, because people need jobs. Second of all, because I'm, well known on social media. Everybody loves to work with you and wants to work with you. So, which is good. It's a blessing, and I love it. But anyways, forgot where I was going with this. Oh yeah. So we interview a lot of people for these type of contracts, but the hospital systems have this all backwards. Now there's different ways of doing it. Some hospital systems and these big corporations will say, listen, here's kind of what we pay everyone. Your starting salary is going to be $400, $450, let's say, or $400. Let's just keep it even. $400. We think you'll probably generate about 6,000 RVUs. If you hit 8,000, you get an extra $150. Very reasonable. You'll never go under 4,000. You can ask them, what happens if my RVUs are under 6,000? Well, if it's a year or so here and there, no big deal. But if it becomes chronic, we can renegotiate, right? Very reasonable. Some of these hospital systems offer these very predatory contracts. Like, I've interviewed over the last year, I'd say probably 20. Well, I've had conversations with, so let's put it this way. I've had conversations with probably close to 30 different cardiology fellows, including our own. They share their contracts with us and all the different offers and different parts of the country that they're going to. And then we have a bunch of people that apply online. And usually I'm the one that kind of screens them, talk to them. I'm the one that posts the ads on LinkedIn or, makes the social media posts, whatever. So I get to see a lot of these contracts. The amount of people we end up interviewing is just a handful. And if you've made it to an interview, we probably really want you and we think you're great. And I'll do a whole other video on like what not to say in interviews because I think some of this stuff is fascinating. But some of these places have these super predatory contracts where like, hey, we'll give you $850,000. And you're like, whoa, that's like unheard of money for the vast majority of people in the world. If you told them we'll give you $850,000, they could live for the rest of their lives like a king in whatever country they live in. And even in the United States, the vast majority of people, when they hit $1 million, they view that as like FU money, where you could pretty much live for the rest of your life without going to work and not even having a job, right? So I get that. Obviously, this comes from a place of privilege, and I apologize because these numbers are astronomical sometimes. But some of these places, let's just say Columbus, Ohio, and I have no idea, but let's just say Columbus, Ohio, which is not that far from me, says, we'll give you $850, come work for us. You go there, you sign your contract, you're super excited, and you're like, yes, it's a guaranteed contract, but they only guarantee it for the first year or two. That's one of the things you got to look out for when you're applying. They guarantee you that contract for 1 or 2 years, right? And you go there and you start working, you're making $850. You're like, yeah, man, that's like, $70,000 a month, maybe something like that, some crazy outrageous number. You're doing real well. You love it. You're doing awesome. Then, your RVUs aren't that high that you're generating, but they're not terrible either. And you have no idea what your RVUs are because, you don't know. You don't measure. Nobody tells you. Next year comes around and you're doing the same thing. They've hired another guy and another guy. Every year they hire more. And now your RVUs are still not that high. You're like, man, I'm living life. I'm making $850. I don't work as much as I thought I would. I'm a cardiologist. I thought I was going to be working like a crazy person. And then it turns out that you're not generating enough revenue for for what they want. So then the third year comes along where you're no longer guaranteed, and now you're on RVUs only, or like, performance only. And if you didn't negotiate a high enough hourly rate, so an RVU, let's say most RVUs for a cardiologist generating, 90th percentile RVUs is usually in the $77 to $80 per RVU range, right? Obviously, there are some cases where it might be in the 65 to 75 range. And then if you're really low, probably in the 50s. So you had negotiated your contract unknowingly that in year 3, you're only going to be making 55 per RVU. And now your RVUs are only like 5,000. If you do the math, let's say 50 times 5, what's that, like 250,000 a year? You're like, whoa, what is going on here? How come I'm only making like 250,000 this year? Well, that's your RVUs. That's the performance you're making. And they already hired the next guy anyways, so they really don't care. What they're trying to do is they cast a wide net. They hire a whole bunch of people and see who sticks. If the patients like you and you're personable and you keep getting more referrals and the primary doctors like you and they refer people to you and you're this, wonderful person, great. You might end up doing really, really well. The fact of the matter is, as a cardiologist, you're not that amazing. You're very replaceable. And I always tell this to people, as amazing and awesome we think we are, you can't have an ego that's up here because you're just a cardiologist, just like the rest of us. If you follow the guidelines and do your job, you're just a number. You're just an ordinary, everyday, average cardiologist, just like the rest of us. So I don't think people understand that. Now, I will tell you, and I told the fellows this at that last conference. I said, listen, you guys are the prize. You have to view yourself as the prize. The job is not the prize. When you guys are applying for a job next year, when you guys are looking for jobs, you're the prize. The job is not the prize. You are not looking for a job, and when you find and land one, you're so happy and amazing that this is the job. You are Tom Brady. You are the top of the top. They want you. You're the prize. So make them pay. Negotiate your contract in a way that you don't get screwed after a year if you plan on going the employment route. And a lot of these places are very desperate and they will pay. And you should make them pay. Do not undervalue yourself. Do not view the job as the prize. You are actually the prize. And that didn't click to them, but a lot of people came up to me afterwards and they were like, man, that was really good. I never viewed it that way, and I really should. Because if you undervalue yourself, these people are just going to take advantage of you, and you shouldn't let them do that. We have had so many offers, even in Chicago, back when I was, in training. Some of the offers you get are just ridiculous from these large corporations that want to buy you. They come in and lowball you. They throw you up a 1-year guaranteed $800,000, but then your RVU rate, you're really lucky if you make 300 after that first year guarantee or whatever it might be. So do not do this, because the other thing is you lose your leverage too. You're basically screwing your own self. Let's say they hire a group of vascular surgeons, not a group. They hire 1, then they hire 2, then they hire 3. Now you guys are 4. And the corporation is in charge of you. You cannot negotiate. You cannot go up to them and be like, look, we're only making 55 per RVU. It needs to be 65. We want it to be 65 because that's what the average vascular surgeon makes. And I don't know what you guys told us in the beginning, but that guaranteed 700 that you gave us, we're all making like 350, 380 right now based on these 55 RVUs. We want it to be 65, so at least we can get back up to 600 or whatever it might be. I'm just making up numbers here, but they're probably close to scenarios and things that I've heard. But you have no leverage. They come back to you and they say, hey, well, that sounds like a great idea. We can bump you up to 56. And you're like, what? 56? What do you mean? And then they're like, take it or leave it. You have no leverage. You can't say anything unless you and those other 4 vascular surgeons, and I'm just making this up. I just threw vascular surgeons out there. Unless you and those other surgeons decide as a group to bounce or go on strike or not see patients anymore, you're done. And they don't even care. We have had all kinds of specialties leave. Cardiothoracic surgery. We had cardiothoracic surgeons leave, and almost any specialty you can imagine. Neurologists and neurointerventional neurologists, all these people leave. They don't care. They just hire locums because there's always somebody looking for locums. Locums are temporary doctors. They hire a guy, bring him in. He works for 6 months until they find that guy that will come and work for them. And they offer insanely high salaries. The second you and your 4 surgeons leave, they bring in a locums guy. They pay him ridiculous amounts of money, 3 to 4 times, 6 times more than what they were paying you, because they need that service line covered. So they don't care. U4 bounced or went on strike or whatever it is. They hire locums. They pay him $6,000 a day, like ridiculous amounts of money to just sit there and cover emergencies, basically, do a few things here and there until they hire more vascular surgeons. They go through the same process again. They offer that $980,000. Come here, we'll pay you $980. Come here, we'll pay you, $1 million, $1.5 million. I've seen ridiculous numbers, $1.5 million to go be a cardiologist in Alaska was one of the highest ones I've seen. And that was 18 years ago. To be a cardiologist in Alaska, 1.5 million. I'm sure today that's probably like 2.8 million. But they offer you these insane numbers, and then they just rebuild the program with new guys that are new graduates who have no idea. And this happens over and over and over again. There's no incentive for these corporations to... It depends on the corporation, obviously, but there's generally no incentive for these corporations to think about the long-term consequences. They don't really care about patients. They care about dollars and they care about numbers. And a lot of these are nonprofits, but they're what we call NINOs, nonprofit in name only. NINO, N-I-N-O, nonprofit in name only. Although they're nonprofits and they're not supposed to make money, although nonprofits are supposed to make money, that's not the point. But they don't truly, when you ask them and we meet with them, we meet with them, we have tons of meetings, and they are generally all good people. And a lot of them serve a mission. They serve the mission of whatever mission it is. The Franciscan Alliance was huge in Indianapolis and Northwest Indiana. All of these places have missions that they serve. And they are serving the mission by taking care of the poor and the needy in their community, all of that. I don't doubt that at all. And I know each one of them has pure intentions, generally speaking. But a lot of these like CEO types, C-suite types, all of that, they are looking for the next job. Like these people generally, and I'm not talking about anybody in particular that I know. So if any of you guys are watching this has nothing to do with you. But generally speaking, when you are an executive or a C-suite person in a corporation, you're always looking for the next job. Like if you're making 1.2 million a year, you're always trying to get the job that's 2.8 million a year and then 4 million a year. All you do is go to meetings all day. Like how hard is that? But if you show a little bit of 10% improvement here and a 5% improvement in that, and then you put it on your resume, I helped grow this, we added 2 more hospitals, we did this, we did that, you're looking for the next job all the time. And that those incentives don't always align with patient care and the community, the poor and the needy that you are serving. That's kind of where this problem aligns. And the problem is it's incentive structures. It has nothing to do with your intentions. Everybody has great intentions. My intentions are to help everybody as much as humanly possible. Same thing usually with these executives. That's what they originally want to do. But they realize that these 4 vascular surgeons are asking for more money. They've been here for 10 years or 10 decades, let's say. Well, not 10 decades, you'd be dead. But let's say they've been here for 4 decades. They've been here for 40 years. They're getting greedy on us, but the community loves them. They're doing great work. They love the community. They donate to the American Heart Association, the Blood Bank, the Red Cross, the local churches, the underserved area, the Latino population, the African Americans, and all of this. They've been doing that for 40 years, but they're getting greedy. And as if like you're not getting greedy, right? You're making probably like $3 million a year and you're not greedy, but all, your little vascular surgeons are. And all of a sudden you're like, well, what are we going to do? They're going to go on strike, or they're not going to work for this and they're not going to work for that. You start hiring their replacements, reduce their salaries because they're not generating enough RVUs. The next guy's on a guaranteed salary for $980,000. You don't care. These guys will quit pretty soon before he leaves, or before he's back. He's on performance or he's on RVUs. And ultimately, it's a cycle that's become like way too common and way too often. Another thing that I think is a huge problem when it comes to incentive structures is patient care and patient outcomes is no longer like a actual incentive. For example, in the ER, I remember a lot of my friends that graduated with me became emergency room doctors back in the early 2000s. It was really popular to become emergency room doctors. So a lot of people in my class became emergency room doctors, and we stay in touch. We talk a lot. In the emergency room, If a patient is doing really, really well and you can send them home, that would be optimal. It's good for patients to go home, right? I mean, that's what we want. If you're a patient, you come into the ER, they're like, oh, it's nothing. You're totally fine. Just go home. Follow up with your doctor here. We actually put in your appointment. You'll see them, tomorrow. Not a big deal, right? But the hospital upstairs, they benefit the most if you admit at least 18% of the people that walk into the ER. And 18 to 20% seems to be about a national cutoff that they expect or want you to do. And it becomes problematic because better patient care would be sending patients home. Better revenue for the hospital is admitting everybody who has, whatever problem it might be, a COPD exacerbation, a little bit of cough, maybe pneumonia, maybe the flu, maybe a little, fake chest pain that turns out to be nothing. Whatever it might be, there's an incentive for the hospital to have more admissions, and there's an incentive that the better outcomes for patients would be to go home if you need to go home. There's also the incentive of churn, right? This is something people don't know a lot about. When a patient is admitted to the hospital, let's say in my specialty, something like heart failure, acute systolic decompensated heart failure, right? The hospital gets, let's say, $30,000 for that admission and that diagnosis. The sooner I get them out of there and put somebody else in that bed where they can get another $30,000, they obviously make more money. For me, though, if the patient still needs to stick around an extra day where they're occupying the bed a little bit longer because they're not better yet, it's actually better for the patient if we can get them out sooner. Whereas it's better for the hospital it might be better for the patient to stay one extra day, whereas it's better for the hospital to get them out sooner. So the incentives don't always align there. There's also Medicare, and they're not going to pay for readmissions. If a patient is readmitted to the hospital with heart failure after you just admitted them and discharged them, you're not going to get paid again, neither you nor the hospital. So there's all these conflicting incentive programs, and I don't know that we have a perfect answer for that yet, but sometimes the incentives don't align, where if you can send a patient home, that means the patient is fine, but if you admit them to the hospital does better financially. So there's a lot of issues with incentives when it comes to that kind of structure. So the other issue, obviously, first of all, when it comes to being employed, there's lack of autonomy, lack of, all that stuff. You can't decide your own decisions. You can't, make, all that stuff. If you want to be an entrepreneur where you own yourself and no one can tell you what to do, obviously there's certain guidelines you got to stick to. But if you don't want someone always meeting with you and telling you to increase this and decrease that, it becomes a problem. There's also incentive problems when, so first of all, the hospital administrators, and again, I'm not saying this in a way that is negative about hospital administrators because I know a lot of them. A lot of them are my personal friends. I golf with them. They're buddies of mine. And we get along. And it's a whole systematic problem. It's not my problem. It's not their problem. This is the system they were thrown into, and they need to make a living to feed their families, and I need to make a living to feed my family. So I'm just telling you the structure, not the individuals themselves. But there's also a problem with the administrators. They noticed early on that there was this conflict with the doctors. We can't just keep telling doctors, stop ordering echoes if the patient already had an echo a month ago, right? But what if the patient needs an echo, right? So what they did is they said, well, what if we bring on these physician ambassadors or physician liaisons, or we start bringing physicians into the C-suite? We could have the chief medical officer, and we could have the board of whatever committee and the medical something committee and the quality control committee and all this stuff. So they bring in physicians into these hospital roles to be the go-between between the administration and the C-suite people, the financial people, these doctors that are on the boards of all these committees, and then the actual doctors that do the day-to-day work. And they may still be doctors that do the day-to-day work still, but they're kind of go-in-betweens where a pulmonologist might come up to me and say, hey, Dr. Allo, we see that cardiology isn't ordering as much echoes as they did last year. What's going on? Can you order more echoes? Because the hospital obviously profits off of this. Or they might come to us and say, hey, quality control, we're getting dinged on heart failure because you guys are ordering echoes on patients that already had an echo. They're not getting paid for, which is also a waste of resources and finances. And I'm not saying this is either right or wrong. I'm just giving examples. Obviously, we don't want to waste money and order unnecessary testing, which I'm a huge proponent of. In fact, if you watch most of my videos, you will see that I'm a huge proponent of not ordering medications or testing or supplements or whatever it is, unless it's absolutely needed and absolutely proven to have a benefit. A lot of these medications are like, why don't you prescribe this, Dr. Allo? Because it has no benefit. There's no proven outcomes. Why would you not order a tilt test or a whatever test? Because there's no change in clinical outcomes. I'm a huge proponent, obviously, of saving money and not ordering testing when it's not needed. And obviously that would be optimal. The next big thing that, that we need to address is a lot of patients come up to me and say, man, I used to go to so-and-so, and now thank God I found you guys. One of the biggest problems with corporate medicine is the pressure to see more patients. And it might not be like this everywhere, but I get a lot of complaints from patients saying, hey, doc, I only talked to my doctor for 2 minutes. And literally, this is a very common complaint. If you look at the data, and I've published this, in multiple videos, the average doctor talks to their patients for 100 seconds, 1 minute and 40 seconds. And this has been published. You can look at the National Health Institute, I believe. I have it on my website somewhere. But 1 minute and 40 seconds is all you get with your doctor. That is really sad. And a lot of patients complain that, the doctor was in and out in 30 seconds, or, I didn't even get to see the doctor for more than a minute. And this is problematic. And corporate medicine, in a lot of scenarios, forces you to quickly see as many patients as humanly possible. Now, there are obviously, don't get me wrong, there are probably places where they say, don't worry about it, see as many patients as you can. But again, the incentives start to kick in. Like, why should I see 25 if I can get away with seeing 15? Wouldn't it be better care to see only 15 and spend a lot of time with them? Sure, all of that may be true. But again, the incentives and the money at play starts to become problematic. So those are other things you also need to think about. The other thing that I think is great about private practice, which kind of goes along with this, is your patients really, really well. Like, there's an incentive for me as a cardiologist in private practice to really care. Not that doctors don't care, but you should really care. You should know your patients inside out. You should talk to them. You should be their friends. When you see them on the football field, I coach football, obviously, so I see a lot of people in my town. But if you coach football or you're out, in the charity groups that you work with or whatever it might be, there's a lot of incentive for you to be like super friendly, super outgoing, super social. Whereas if you were a doctor who just gets a salary and goes home, that incentive really isn't there. And you're probably not making as much. So you're not going to be out there donating to the Red Cross and volunteering at the soup kitchens and the mission, whatever. You're going to be probably less financially well off. And I get this is super relative. I get that. I said this in the beginning. I know this comes from a place of privilege. But if you're a doctor that's not making it to the maximum potential that you could make, you're not going to be able to give back to society. Like, one of the things that I always teach, and you guys have seen this a lot in my videos, I went into this field, I went into cardiology, mainly because I wanted to be a football coach. I know that sounds crazy, but I love football. I played football, I coach football, I've been doing it for years. I have websites on football, I have books on football. I went into cardiology so I could have enough time and money to spend on things that I love. One of them is coaching football, mentoring youth. I've coached every youth sport you can imagine. Basketball, golf, softball, baseball, basketball. But mainly my love is football. I've coached all those other sports, but the one I've coached the most and played the most all the way till I was really old almost. And just last year I played up until I got injured. I played flag, don't get me wrong. But I played tackle football up until I was about 40. Obviously not any way professionally, but just for fun with, friends. But either way, like, when you have more disposable income, we give back to society. We give to the heart associations. We give to people in need. We donate to things we love, like the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. If you've had members that have affected by this, the diabetes associations, people's random fundraisers for their kid to go to high school or play lacrosse and get the equipment they need. So many times in various leagues that I've been in, I've told the administrators, listen, if a parent says, I want to sign up, but I can't afford the $80 or $300 for the equipment, tell them, don't worry about it. We have a sponsor for you and I'll take care of it. So there's a lot of stuff you can do when you have more disposable income, and society is better. Now, if you're a corporate doctor and you're just getting paid your W-2 and, 55% of it gets taken out for taxes and all that, and, you don't have a lot of leeway and not a lot of disposable income. The other thing, obviously, and without even getting too deep into the finances and accounting, when you're your own owner, you own your own practice, and you're not just getting a W-2, but you also have 1099s, and you have distributions and partnerships and LLCs, there's a whole lot you could do more than if you were just a corporate doctor. And corporations are pretty much ruthless. If one of your employees, Jenny, has a flat tire, corporation ain't paying for Jenny's tire. If Melissa or John's air condition goes out or heat goes out in the winter, you cannot call the CEO of Kaiser Permanente and be like, hey, can you help me out a bit here? I need a couple of $1,000. My heat went out. That ain't going to happen. But at a company like us or at a private corporation where you are partners and everybody knows the partners and everybody knows the owner, you can call and say, hey, look, I'm struggling here. Can you give me a hand? Absolutely. You could do that in a smaller, privately owned group and corporation. So I highly recommend, if you're very entrepreneurial, to do that. Now, there are pitfalls, and I discussed some of them. You got to do everything. You got to be good at everything. Now, you don't have to be good at everything, but somebody in your group has to be good at everything. We have one person that's good at contracts, one person that's good at social media, one person's good at marketing, one person runs all the CHF clinics, one person, does all the meetings with the corporations and the committees and all that stuff. One person's an outreach person to family doctors and other groups and other cities. One person is better at, whatever it might be. That helps tremendously when you have a lot of people with different talents and they all work together. One of the biggest pitfalls, though, in private corporations is when you have one person kind of dominating everything, or if the financial structure is just set up completely wrong. And we've seen that before. Well, you have one person, and I've talked to a friend of mine who used to work in a different city. They had one person who was in charge of everything. They were taking money off the top. They were in charge. They could never be fired. They were doing all kinds of stuff that no one really wanted to work for them. So eventually that group collapsed. It no longer exists, and they all end up getting normal corporate jobs and just working somewhere. Another huge problem when you're not in private practice is they'll fight you on consults. Like, for example, an employed cardiologist, when the ER calls them and says, hey, we got one for you, 42-year-old female, blah, blah. They're like, why are you giving me this consult? This is a nonsense. This isn't cardiac. Send them over here. They don't need cardiology. Whereas you call me, you're like, cool, put them in, put me on consult. I'll take care of it, because my incentive is to see more patients. Their incentive is to not see more patients because they're getting paid a fixed salary and they don't care to see more patients, whereas we actually do. Another huge problem that seems to happen with these corporations is they always try to sneak in crazy language into your contract. Like, you'll have this amazing meeting, they're recruiting you, and they're like, Doc, you're amazing, you're awesome, you're the Tom Brady of cardiology, we're going to pay you $850,000 a year. This is going to be awesome. You meet with the administrators, you meet with the guy in charge of the cardiovascular service line, you meet with the cath lab director, you meet with all these amazing people, and they all say the right stuff. And they recruit you there, and you want to come there, and it all sounds amazing. And then it goes to legal, and legal sends you this document to sign, which is your contract. And if you don't read it carefully, there is some crazy stuff in there that you had no idea. And then you message the guy, your contact guy, hey, what is this all about? You can fire me at any time with no cause by just giving me a 20-day notice. And they're like, what do you mean? The lawyers must have done that. And they always got that excuse. Oh, that was the legal team. And then you ask them another question. They're like, what is this? Well, we never discussed this. Like, you said 3 years, not 1.5. What is this? And they're like, oh, that must be legal. That must be legal. But like, if you don't have a very savvy, smart attorney looking at your contract, you're going to get killed with some of this stuff. So I highly recommend you hire a very well-educated, top-notch attorney that specifically looks at physician contracts, hopefully even in your field. Now, this isn't a huge legal video, so I'm going to not get too deep into that, but just know there's a lot of shenanigans that go around once you guys decide on everything and it's amazing and that you love them and they love you and yay, we're amazing. This is awesome. We got our next new amazing cardiologist. Then boom, you got this crazy looking stuff in your contract that you never ever expected. Another problem that obviously could happen is if you go to work for a private group is you could end up with a bunch of partners that are crazy. I've seen in Chicago and other places, and I've heard a lot of nightmare stories because people share a lot of stories with me. You know, when you're popular on social media, everyone wants to tell you their story. And I love it because I can help people. A lot of people have actually consulted me on, hey, I know you're in private practice. How did you do it? What did you do? Here's my problem. So sometimes you end up in a group where the partners are nuts. One guy's OCD, one guy's introverted, one guy doesn't want to work, one guy's overbearing, one guy is always in the cath lab. Like, you know, there's all these crazy personalities, and if they don't mesh and they don't have a way of working together, you could kind of be stuck. But at least, you know, make sure your contract is like 1 or 2 years and you could get out if you want to. Make sure it's a nice, you know, contract that you're getting. But that's one of the pitfalls that could be in private practice. Now, there's obviously a lot. You know, you're responsible for everything, and we've kind of gone over some of that, but that's one that I hadn't thought of just yet. Another big problem with corporate medicine, and I think one of the reasons why we inherit a lot of patients, we get a lot of patients because a lot of my patients tell me, I didn't want to go to that group anymore. Well, why? You know, I always ask because, you know, when you own the company, you care. You want to know, what should we not do? This is another thing. Like, you take responsibility, you take ownership, you take agency over your company. So when people come to me and say, oh, I used to see so-and-so, what happened? You know, that actually is more interesting to me than the actual conversation we're about to have about their medical problems. As a owner of a cardiology practice, the second a patient tells me, or my nurse tells me, hey, this guy used to see Dr. Jones, now he's seeing you, that is my question. That's what we're going to talk about. Why did you stop seeing Dr. Jones? What happened? And one of the biggest things, first of all, there's always like, we just didn't click. He wanted me to do this and I wanted to do that. No big deal. Or my insurance changed. Also, no big deal. You know, your insurance changed. You can see me now, and I'm more than happy to see you. And that's one of the things that's super cool when you're private practice. If somebody calls and says, hey, we got a patient, can we put him in on your schedule? We just say, put him in right away. We'll see him tomorrow. We'll see him today. Put him in today. Can you walk in? Walk him across the hall. You know, put him in right now. As a private practice physician, you care and you want to see as many patients as possible, because once a patient is kind of your patient, they generally don't fire their doctors. And we love taking care of patients. That's why we went into this field. We love the relationships we build. We love all of that. So one of the things that happens is when they come to me and they say, I don't see Dr. Jones anymore. I'm a former patient of so-and-so. That is super interesting to me. Why? I want to know why. Like, I'm willing to talk to you for 3 hours if you can tell me what not to do in my practice that Dr. Jones did in his practice. And it can be a lot of things. Sometimes it's just that I never saw the same doctor twice. I kept telling them I want to see only the doctor, or I liked this one nurse practitioner and they kept giving me another one, or I didn't like the waiting room. I didn't like whatever. Like, it could be anything. And if you don't sit down and take time to find out from your patients why they switch to you or what they expect, then you're not doing your job. Another thing is, it helps you become a better doctor. If, for example, a patient comes in and says, I used to see Mrs. Kelly, I don't see Dr. Kelly anymore, whatever it is, and you say, why? Like, she kept trying to put me on metoprolol, and I keep telling her metoprolol doesn't work for me, and she keeps telling me metoprolol works for me. Or she kept wanting to order a stress test, and I don't want to do a stress test. Last time I did it, I almost died. Then that tells me not to do a stress test, right? So it makes you a better doctor. We're like, okay, where can we go from here? Well, how did the stress test almost kill you? Like, what happened? Well, I started getting nervous. I freaked out. I had a panic attack, and I just didn't want to do it. Okay, well, that's a different problem. Well, I got on the treadmill, and my heart raced, and I went into VTAC, and they were doing chest compressions on me, and I literally basically died, and they brought me back. Oh, well, that's a huge problem. So that's definitely not a stress test that we want to do on you. So it makes you a better doctor. Well, instead of a stress test, how about we just do a CT coronary angiogram, or how about we do an ultrasound of your heart, or how about we do a blood test? You know, there's other things, and it helps you become a better doctor when you actually ask these questions. I can say that if you're a corporate doctor, obviously not everyone, but most corporate employed physicians, W-2 employees, will probably be like, oh, you don't see Miss Dr. Kelly anymore? Cool. Hey, what can I do for you? Like, they're not inquisitive. They're not going to ask. They don't care. Some do. Don't get me wrong. Probably the vast majority do. But you got to look at the incentives. The incentives just don't align. Like, why would I got 80 more patients in my waiting room. I'm getting paid a W-2. They're probably going to cut my salary this year. They already cut my vacation time. I don't own anything in this company. They didn't give me equity. What on earth Why on earth would I even spend an extra 30 seconds on this topic? The patient's here in front of me. They're saying they have chest pain. Here's what we're going to do. There's no incentive in that. And I'm not saying these are bad doctors. They're all amazing physicians. They went into this field usually to help people. But when the incentives don't align, and just even subconsciously, they don't do this on purpose, but subconsciously, there's no real motivation or reason why you would even ask these questions or why you'd even think of this or waste or spend time on this thing. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but that's what happens when the incentives don't align. The other thing that happens at a lot of these corporate places is they're always hiring your replacements. No matter what happens, they're hiring the next nurse practitioner to replace you, or the next cardiologist to replace you, or the next family doctor to replace you. They're always looking for cheaper labor force. They don't do this on purpose. Like none of these people in these business suites sit around and say, hey, is there any way we can hire a bunch of PAs and NPs to replace the emergency room department? They don't do that. Like, that would sound crazy. And if anybody said that at a meeting, they'd be laughed at. But what happens is they're trying to hire a doctor. Nobody wants to come to Toledo, Ohio for $250,000 as an emergency room doctor. They're like, what are we going to do? We need to fill these last couple shifts. We need another full-time employee, which is a FTE, full-time employee. We need one more FTE or two more FTEs or whatever it might be. If we can't get a doctor, let's just hire an NP. There's a lot of NPs. We actually have some in-house. We could train them. Okay, let's hire an NP. Another month or year goes by, Dr. So-and-so is retiring next month. What are we going to do? And then, it's like a snowball that just keeps rolling. They're not doing it on purpose, but what's happening is over time, they are hiring replacements. And I'm not saying anything bad about NPs or physician's assistants. We have them in our practice. We hire them. We love them. They do a phenomenal job, and I'll put my NPs up against anybody. Go listen to my audio-only podcast where I talked about nurse practitioners. My NPs that are specialized in cardiology, because we train them, I'll put them up against anybody. So it's not really an issue about NPs, but it's an issue of when the incentives don't align. The second they hire you, they're already looking to replace you, and they're always looking to save money and cut corners because, again, they're looking for the next job. They're looking to save money for the mission. They're looking because they're a nonprofit. They want to not lose as much next year or lose a little bit less. So it has nothing to do with you, the doctor, or the NPs, or the patients, or anything. It all has to do with the incentive structure. The entire system is kind of wired backwards. That's why I recommend that everyone, if you can, go into private practice, because you won't have to deal with this nonsense. The problem is going into private practice, you may be starting from scratch. It may just be you. You may be a small group and not make as much. You may be a bigger group, and it just depends on how much of a go-getter you are. I know that most physicians that I knew growing up were go-getters. They were all entrepreneurial. My dad and all his friends, they were all own their own private practices. They learned business pretty quickly. Obviously, they're not great businessmen sometimes, but they definitely knew how to run medical practices. But they're definitely not always the perfect businessmen. But you could always hire that out. You could hire a fractional CEO, which is like a CEO that works for you 3 days out of the week or 2 days out of the week or 1 day a month, whatever it is. You can hire business people to help you run your business part of the practice while you do the medical side, but you are still an owner and you're paying the CEO, as opposed to having non-medical people tell you what to do. And that's a huge issue when you have people who are not medical telling medical people what to do. Now, I know they've alleviated that by bringing in doctors into their groups, and that helps a little, but definitely that can be an issue too. So anyways, I could go on for hours about this. If you guys like this topic and want more about it, reach out to me, put it in the comments. I'll be more than happy to discuss more of this. I could literally go on for like 3 hours. I've been in private practice for 15, 16 years now, plus a lot of experience before in Chicago, another 10 years before in Chicago. So if you like this stuff, let me know. Put some comments down there. I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. If you want to hop on a call and discuss this or how to open up your own private practice or what to think of, let me know as well. I talk to people about this almost every day.